Good morning. I think we can get started now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I'm Michele Waslin. I'm the Interim Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to today's webinar on immigration trends and developments in Minnesota. If you're not familiar with us, the IHRC aims to transform the way we understand immigration in the past and the present. We believe that we can use lessons from our history to inform our current national immigration conversation. And a great way to start this conversation is with the data that our speakers are going to provide today. So I'm relatively new to the U, and it didn't take me much time to realize that I am surrounded by many immigration and global migration experts. And one of the first things I did was to start a list of all of the faculty and staff who study or research global migration or immigration to the United States. And thanks to Jan Franzen and her colleagues at the university libraries for creating the experts at umn.edu tool that allowed me to identify more than 100 migration and immigration scholars all across the university. So now I'm working with our co-sponsors, the James H. Binger Center for New Americans and the Center for Global Health and Social Responsibility to identify ways to engage this multidisciplinary group of scholars and to really create opportunities for collaboration. We see a lot of potential for joint research projects, co-sponsored events, opportunities to present your work, and opportunities to share information with your students and with your networks. So this webinar is really a first step toward beginning that conversation about collaboration by sharing useful, up-to-date information about immigrants in Minnesota and at the U. And then in the next weeks and months, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how migration and immigration scholars at UMN can communicate with one another and collaborate. So a couple of housekeeping things first. This webinar is being recorded. The question and answer portion will happen in the Q&A function. You could submit questions for any speaker at any time during the presentation. And we're going to turn to audience questions at the end of the program. You can also choose to submit your questions anonymously if you don't want your name mentioned. I also want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus is located on Dakota land, and today many Indigenous people, including Dakota and Ojibwe, call the Twin Cities home. So now I will stop talking and introduce you to our three speakers. First, we're going to have Dr. Susan Brower. She is the Minnesota State Demographer, and she directs the Minnesota State Demographic Center. Susan travels the state talking with Minnesotans about the new social and economic realities that are brought about by recent demographic shifts. Susan's work applies an understanding of demographic trends to change in a range of areas, including the state's economy and workforce, education, health, immigration, and rural population changes. Susan earned her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan, and she holds a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs here at the University of Minnesota. Next, we're going to hear from Marissa Hill-Dongre. She is the Assistant Director for Compliance and Legal Affairs in the University of Minnesota's Global Programs and Strategy Alliance. Marissa's work at the university covers a wide range of international and immigration-related issues. She provides advice, support, and guidance in policy and professional matters affecting university students, faculty, and staff. She also directs the university's immigration response team. And then we will have Julia Decker, who is the Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. She previously served as the Policy Director at the ACLU of Minnesota, and she was a teaching fellow at the University of Minnesota's Law School's Binger Center for New Americans, and she is a 2014 graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Brower. Thank you, Dr. Brower.
Thank you, Michele. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Let me just share my screen here. I've been asked to share with you just some recent trends in immigration in the Twin Cities metro area and in Minnesota, kind of to kick us off and give us a sense of where we are today with respect to immigrant communities in Minnesota and what different levels and trends have looked like. So that is what I'm going to share with you just very briefly. The first thing that's important to know about immigration in Minnesota and really in the US is that it's in a very different growth context than it has been in the past. And by that, I mean, whereas the state used to grow really by births, by having more births than deaths, or what we call natural increase, that's something that is starting to become less and less of a factor in our growth, and going forward, it will become a very small factor in our growth. So when we have very little natural increase from births, we have to look to other sources of growth if we're going to continue the same kind of level of growth or the same trajectory that we've been on. And so for that reason, immigration, international immigration, migration from other states becomes a much more important source of growth than it has been in the past. And that's where we are today. The graph that I'm showing you here, the blue bars are showing you the growth that's attributable to the number of births minus the number of deaths, or kind of the internal natural change that we have here in the 7-county metro area. You can see that it's been declining since about mid-decade. The blue bars are declining here, and we expect that those will continue to decline as we age as a metro area and as a state, and as we have lower and lower birth rates. In the Twin Cities and in Minnesota, we don't have a whole lot of domestic migration helping us out in terms of growth. In fact, we often tend to be net exporters of people to other states. And so international immigration in this context, the green bars that you see here, really become an important source of growth as these changes are occurring. Now, if we look kind of at the trends in the immigrant communities in Minnesota, one way to do that is just to look at the percent that's foreign born in Minnesota and the Twin Cities compared to the US. And the first thing that's noticeable is that the growth in the foreign-born population really increased rapidly after about 1990. And you can see that's true of the US, it's true of Minnesota. Those growth rates were about the same since 1990 up through about 2010. And then we've seen a leveling off of international immigration a bit. We've seen a leveling off of the growth of the foreign-born population, both in the US and in Minnesota. I'll just note that the Twin Cities growth rate has kind of continued its strong growth trajectory throughout the time period. And that is likely because the international immigration is really a metro and urban phenomenon, at least initially. And so the metro areas tend to attract more new immigrants and new foreign-born residents than rural areas. This is quite a graph, but I'll walk you through it. It's pretty cool, I think. It's showing us just where foreign-born residents of the state have come from over time. And I created this graph using the IPUMS, which is from the Minnesota Population Center, using Decennial and American Community Census data. And it really shows us the shift that has occurred over the last decade in where immigrants are coming from. If you look back to 1990, the largest group of foreign-born in the state of Minnesota were from Europe. And you can see that that number has stayed pretty stable over time. Excuse me. That number of European foreign-born in the state has stayed pretty stable over time, as we've seen a tremendous growth in both the Asian, African, and Latin American populations of foreign-born residents. You can see that kind of leveling off in the last decade as well, particularly for Asian and Latin American residents. But in terms of African immigration, we continue to see a really steep climb in the number of foreign-born in Minnesota coming from the continent of Africa. And if we look a little bit more closely at where our the largest groups of foreign-born residents are coming from, we can really start to see the great diversity of immigration patterns, and it kind of gives us a sense of the different kind of flows and push factors and maybe pull factors that are shaping our current immigration context. You can see, for example, that the largest group to come here to Minnesota, to the US, and to land in Minnesota in the last 5 years are immigrants coming from India. Now, about 85% of those have a bachelor's degree or higher. And so it's a very highly educated group, many of whom are coming on H-1B visas to land a specific job in one of our businesses here in the state. We also see a fair number of refugees coming to the state still, and historically Minnesota has been a state that has settled refugees since the 1970s. And you can see that here with respect to groups coming from Somalia, from Ethiopia, the Karen that you can see as well, all refugee groups. If we look at Minnesota relative to the US, we actually have about 20% of recent immigrants coming as refugees, whereas the US overall has about 10%. So refugee immigration flows make up a substantial proportion of our immigration and of our picture of immigration in the state. And finally, I just want to end with kind of a sense of where higher ed fits with respect to immigration flows. And what we're looking at here is in any given year, people who have come from abroad, who are foreign born, who have come from abroad in the last year. And then we're able to look again using the IPUMs, looking at the share of those who are attending college or grad school once they arrive here. And you can see that, that number varies over time. The overall flow of people to the US varies over time. But certainly those attending college or grad school make up an important proportion, an important share of the overall immigration picture. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back to Michele.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful to get this conversation started. Now I want to turn it over to Marissa.
Hi, thanks, Michele. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be following Susan's presentation. It teased things up so nicely. As Michele mentioned, I work here at the University of Minnesota, and among the things that I do is running the university's immigration response team. So I'm going to provide information based on that work and those experiences. The population of immigrants at the university is reflective in many ways of the broader Minnesota community. Susan's slides, I was taking notes. I was making note of a lot of the information there because it's really interesting to see that data when thinking about the work that I do. So there are, although the university's population of immigrants and foreign-born individuals is reflective of the state's population, there are gaps and lags in underrepresented populations due to the expense of higher education, the requirements for higher education, and many other factors. For some of the reasons that I'll get into later on in my remarks, it can be challenging to provide accurate statistics regarding the exact population of immigrant students at the University of Minnesota. And this is for a variety of reasons. It's partially because applications for admission don't ask the questions that would enable us to collect this information. It's partially because the immigration landscape, the laws, the policies are so complicated. It's partially because this information isn't technically necessary for the purposes of enrolling in higher education. And in many ways, it's better for lots of immigrants if the university doesn't collect and store that information. Having said that, both NAFSA, which is the National Professional Organization for International Education, and a resource called the Higher Ed Immigration Portal have state level data on their websites. I'm going to upload into the chat a resource sheet, and I'll provide links to both of those resources in case you want to get a look at some of that data. So I'm really going to talk about the experiences of immigrant students at the University of Minnesota. The traditional structures of staffing and student support at universities create gaps that immigrant students can easily fall through. For example, applications for admission come in two basic formats, and there's some details that may differ between undergraduate, graduate, professional school admissions, but generally speaking, they come in two formats: a domestic application and an international application. Immigrant students fill out the domestic application and are tracked into student services that don't account for their immigration status. In many respects, that makes sense, and that can be a good thing. There are big differences between immigrant students and international students in terms of the relationship between their immigration status and their academic plans, and the level of involvement in the details of the international student experience is required by federal law, whereas that's not the case for immigrant students. But this can create the unintended consequence of lack of awareness amongst other people in the university community of how immigration status can impact academic plans and, more broadly, the lives of immigrant students, and also students who are from mixed status families who may be permanent residents or citizens themselves, but may be really involved with helping family members navigate the U.S. immigration system. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sort of common subgroups or populations of immigrant students at the University of Minnesota. One prominent group that has gotten a lot of attention because the status has been in the news a lot over the past 6-7 years are individuals who have DACA or are undocumented. As all of you probably know, there's been a movement to end DACA, a movement to defend DACA over the past number of years. The Trump administration tried to end it. There is still ongoing litigation about the legality and validity of DACA going on in the courts. It's challenging because DACA was never never would have worked to be anything more than sort of a temporary solution for the individuals that are eligible for it. But 10 years on, we see that there are fewer and fewer college-age individuals who are eligible for DACA or who have DACA. And so they're caught in a challenging situation with regard to their immigration status. I also just wanted to quickly note that people often sort of think of undocumented people or people with DACA as being from Latin America. And that's not solely the case. Of course, there are individuals from Latin America who are undocumented or have DACA, but the slide that Susan shared that talked the world region of birth slide that showed the regions of the world that immigrants in Minnesota are from, I would say the undocumented and DACA population reflects that as well. There's also an increasing availability and use of humanitarian statuses during the Biden administration. It means that there are many more college students who have those statuses, like humanitarian parole, temporary protected status, asylum applicants. And I don't have time to get into the details of those programs, but would be happy to take questions if people have specific questions about those populations at the university. The dysfunction of U.S. citizenship and immigration services and other government agencies means that applications for immigration status, either initial applications or renewals, move very slowly. And this is really disruptive for students' lives. A lack of familiarity with these statuses and the fact that approaches to treating these categories of students vary across the country results in uneven experiences for students in higher education. And because the immigration system moves so slowly, it's not unusual for students to cycle through multiple different statuses during their time in higher ed. Around the country, especially in the last 10 years, there's been increasing awareness of the challenges that immigrant students face in higher education, and there are a variety of approaches to providing support. Some students are really informed and knowledgeable about their status and how it impacts their education and life more broadly, but others are not and are grappling with trying to understand what it means for their options at the same time that they're going through many of the other challenges and experiences that come with being a college student. Immigration status impacts many things that intersect with higher education: financial aid eligibility, tuition classification, employment and career opportunities, eligibility for government programs related to health insurance, food insecurity, and more. And these programs also vary from state to state and between institutions, so it's confusing. At the University of Minnesota, the Immigration Response Team was created in early 2017, and the initial work of the Immigration Response Team was mainly focused on the Trump administration's travel and Muslim bans and DACA. Time has passed, and some of the issues and challenges remain the same. There are new ones continually coming up. And so the details of the work of the Immigration Response Team have evolved, but the approach remains the same. The idea was that it's intended to be a broad and inclusive resource to help individuals, not just students, but also faculty and staff, and not just at the Twin Cities campus, but system-wide, and also university departments and administrations as they navigate what these changes mean for the institution. So there are a variety of things that are a part of my work with the Immigration Response Team, and these include running a small scholarship fund for immigrant students, most of whom are ineligible for a variety of other kinds of financial aid. I could answer a question about the details if people have more questions about that. Presentations, consultations, referrals, working to be a resource who's familiar with multiple bureaucracies that are intersecting when individuals are dealing with the immigration system and the university's rules and policies. And the real goal is to function as a point of connection and a safe place for individuals who have these concerning questions or this sort of private and important information that they need to talk with someone about. So in wrapping up, I just wanted to say there's a lot more awareness of the existence of and the unique challenges that face immigrant students in higher education, but there's still challenges. It's hard to sustain the public's attention. There's so many pressing issues vying for people's attention, and it's hard to understand and track such complicated information. But it's important to do so because the immigrant community need this support. This community is growing, and it seems likely that things will continue to increase in complexity. And it's really important in my role to be able to connect with and collaborate with partners on campus and more broadly in the community. So I'm happy to be connecting with this group, and I'll wrap it up there, but I hope to have a chance to answer some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for all of that helpful information and for everything you do for immigrant students here at the U. I am going to turn it over to Julia, again, Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. Julia.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for joining this morning. My name is Julia Decker. I am the Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. I have been asked to come and talk to you all a little bit about state policy making with respect to immigrants and refugees in Minnesota. I want to do just a quick level setting, just so folks sort of understand where we live in the advocacy space. I think most of us understand that immigration law is federal law, but sometimes I think there's a little bit of confusion about, well, how much can states actually do? How much work can actually be done in the state space? And the answer is a lot in terms of helping non-citizens, whether it's in economic development or, making criminal laws clearer to understand in terms of immigration consequences. But state policy making can't change any of the sort of bigger issues that, for instance, Marissa was talking about with respect to application times or work authorizations or statuses. Those things are all part of the federal immigration law, and states don't have the power to change those things. But there are a lot of things that states can do, and Minnesota in particular, as many of you know, last session, a lot of things happened at the state legislature, including some very helpful things, some very good things for non-citizens, immigrants, and refugees, as well as a couple of things that raised some cautionary flags for different immigrant populations. So I'll walk through just a few of them, and then we'll be happy to take questions at the end. One thing to note about all of these issues, state policymaking, as with federal policymaking, is usually a multi-year process. So all of these things were not just a one and done, somebody proposed it this year and it got done. These are the kinds of things that can be 5, 10, and in the case of the driver's license bill, 20 years of work. So just understanding that landscape as well. I will dive a little bit into a couple of the pieces, including driver's license for all. And people I'm sure have heard a lot about this, but this is the return to a pre-2003 situation for Minnesota, where people who want to apply for a driver's license in Minnesota do not have to show documentation of their immigration status or citizenship in order to get a license. And so for folks who are undocumented, of course, this is a hard-fought victory. As I said, approximately 20 years of advocacy and working at the Capitol to make this happen. Certainly it has been heralded as a great victory for the immigrant community, and it is. I do want to point out that the way the law works is saying, okay, you don't have to show documentation of your status or citizenship at the time that you're going to apply. People, for any number of reasons, may be a citizen, they may have a particular immigration status or are working on a particular status, but at the time that they go to the DMV, maybe don't have access to that documentation, it hasn't arrived yet, it's caught up in those very long application times that Marissa was talking about. So I think sometimes it can get a little bit confusing or a little bit conflated with the idea that, well, all these people who don't have documentation are obviously undocumented. And the reality is that there can be many situations in which a person at the time that they go to the DMV may not have that particular documentation. The law just says, yeah, as if you can, prove your identity and you are able to, pass all the other tests that everybody else does, you're able to get a license. Another big thing that happened, it's a very small change in the law, but it has major impacts, is reducing the maximum sentence for gross misdemeanors in Minnesota from 365 days to 364 days. And some of you may be wondering, well, why? Who cares about that, right? That's one day. The reason that it's so important is that under federal immigration law, in certain circumstances, that 365-day sentence can lead to what's called an aggravated felony finding. And an aggravated felony finding in immigration proceedings is pretty much an almost automatic deportation. It's very, very difficult for a person in that situation to have any sort of defense against being removed from the country. And it's regardless of whether they've been here, however many years they've been here, how many family connections they have here, it's really, really difficult. What that means is, before this law change in Minnesota, you could have two people in the same position, same criminal conviction, potentially even for the same conduct. One gets a 365-day sentence, one gets a 364-day sentence. The person with the 365 sentence is now potentially facing that aggravated felony conviction or finding in immigration proceedings. The 364-day sentence is not. Now, the 364 could still lead to immigration consequences, but they're not as severe as that 365. And it just is sort of fundamentally just unfair and disparate to have a one-day difference, which many people don't even serve, to then have such disproportionate immigration consequences. And so reducing the maximum sentence for that gross misdemeanor by 1 day basically, obviously avoids that unfairness, make sure that people who are sentenced for gross misdemeanor in Minnesota are not disproportionately impacted depending on 1 day. And it also just provides clarity for everybody in the system, whether it's the defendants or the public defenders or defense lawyers, the prosecutors, the judges, that gross misdemeanor in Minnesota, it's the immigration consequence is not going to be this aggravated felony finding, no matter how, if it's the maximum sentence or not. And I also just want to highlight, people again may be aware of this, but the aggravated felony definition can sort of, I think, give a little bit, maybe have sort of a visceral reaction. The reality is that before this law change, something like a gross misdemeanor shoplifting conviction in Minnesota could also lead to that 365 sentence that then leads to an aggravated felony conviction. So we are not necessarily talking about the things that may automatically or instinctively come to mind when we talk about things like felonies. There were a few other things that passed that were obviously very good. There was Minnesota care coverage being extended. Now that will not happen, I think, for a couple of years here, but Minnesota care coverage being extended to everybody regardless of immigration status. The permanent establishment of the Office of New Americans, which is focused on economic development and sort of career workforce development. Cautionary flags, we saw cannabis legalization, which obviously was a hard-fought victory. Disparate policing, disparate enforcement, the disproportionate impacts on communities of color, being able to see that begin to change. The flip side is that for non-citizens, nothing has changed because under the federal law, cannabis is still federally controlled. And that means that even somebody with a green card, a refugee, anybody who engages in what is a legally mandated market in Minnesota could still face immigration consequences for engaging in any type of activity with respect to cannabis. So there's a little bit of a cautionary note there for non-citizens, just making sure that anybody who's not a citizen understands the ramifications of engaging in cannabis, despite the fact that it's legal in Minnesota. There was also automatic voter registration that passed, which just, again, during the session, advocates making sure that the agencies understood how this could impact people who are not citizens, particularly when you have automatic transfer of information from one agency to another, because some people may be very aware, some people may maybe not, those types of transfers of information where it's saying, oh, these people are citizens and therefore they're eligible to vote, can trigger what's called a false claim to U.S. citizenship. And false U.S. citizenship claims in immigration are often considered some of the most heinous, worst things ever. So just making sure that was thought about as these laws are being passed. So I think that sort of goes to Marissa's point about how things that happen, policies that are passed, may not always have the impact on non-citizens that sort of intuitively people think, or they might not be thinking even at all about how quote unquote good policy might not quite have the same impacts for non-citizen immigrant and refugee communities. I can talk a little bit more about areas for future work, but I will leave that for the Q&A because I want to make sure people have time to ask questions. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michele.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to all of our speakers. That was really a lot of great information. And I think we're going to start to see some questions roll in here from the audience. I'm going to start out with a question for Dr. Brower. You talked about the recent changes in demographics and the countries of origin and education levels and what types of immigrants are settling here in Minnesota and how that makes us kind of unique. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think is the most important demographic trend when it comes to immigration? And how do those trends that you discussed impact the state's economy and workforce?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues that is getting so much attention right now is coming from the fact that we're experiencing such serious labor force shortages. And these shortages started opening up before the pandemic. They dissipated a little bit because of all the movement in and out of the labor force during the pandemic. But since that time, we've continued to see far many more job openings than we have people to fill those jobs. And so I think that as a context behind the current immigration picture in the state and also nationally, we're experiencing many of these same labor force shortages. I think that there is a greater economic pull than perhaps there was, 5 to 10 years ago, because employers are really starting to feel the pain of what it means not to be able to find workers for their jobs. So I'd say that's kind of a contextual background picture that kind of shifts the priority of immigration policy, and a need to find a solution to be able to bring folks here faster and more efficiently than we currently are.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question here from the audience, and I believe this is a question for Julia, although others can respond. Do you have any observation or thoughts on the draft bill called the North Start Act that's been introduced in the Minnesota legislature?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is I just took a quick look at the link. This is sort of the separation ordinance scaled up to the state level. So some of you may be aware of certain municipalities will say, we're not going to ask about immigration status if police, are conducting a traffic stop. We're not going to sort of put our local resources into immigration enforcement because ultimately immigration enforcement is a federal function. I think this is something that I think maybe a couple other states have sort of tried to move on this, and the interaction, as I sort of alluded to in my comments, the interaction between federal and state law is always pretty fraught, and trying to separate out different functions of the state versus the federal government is a really complex and difficult issue. I think that certainly from the immigration perspective, state law enforcement really shouldn't be conducting the immigration enforcement mechanisms, though those are the purview of the federal government. And I think there is sort of a logical understanding that if local law enforcement are seen to be conducting some of those immigration enforcement actions, it can reduce trust and relationships in the community, and can make it more difficult for instance, domestic violence victims to be able to, or to feel like they're able to seek out resources or call law enforcement if they need help. So I think there are those types of discussions to be had. I would say that something like this is, as I said, with any state policymaking, it will likely be a multi-year type project, particularly because it is a very complicated issue. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It means that it will just take time and lots of discussions and probably lots of education with elected representatives to ensure that, people understand what's going on and why this is important.
Great, thank you for that really comprehensive response. Please, anybody in the audience can feel free to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I am going to turn to Marissa. So having listened to Julia's presentation about all the great work that was done in the legislature this year, I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about how those changes impact students and faculty and staff at the university, and perhaps how any of those unintended consequences might impact people here?
Sure, Michelle, thanks for the question. I think, it's interesting because in my experience at the university is often responding to and filtering information about state laws because the university is such a big institution, and because there are so many people who are sort of under that umbrella of the university community, faculty, staff, students, people in the community. Oftentimes when there are new laws, the university is sort of interpreting what those laws mean for the members of the university community. And what I've noticed is that it's still a little bit of work to get the university to pause and think about the fact that there might be different considerations or different impacts for the immigrant community when it comes to those things. So with the cannabis example, I've been inserting myself in a lot of conversations to say, hey, hold on, let's think about the fact that, the university is ready and prepared to think about international students, so people on temporary student visas or international scholars who are here to do research on a short-term basis, and how the rules are different for them. But it's not something that's been on the radar of the folks who are in charge of that messaging to think, to know. And immigration law is so complicated. The whole world does not need to become immigration lawyers, in order to understand this. I wouldn't wish that on them. But those of us who are, what I work to do is to make sure they realize, actually, those impacts that Julia mentioned can impact that sort of disconnect between federal and state law can impact people all the way up to permanent residents, people who really think of themselves and do live here long-term permanently because of the way that the controlled substances, the federal laws impact people, and immigration laws as well. On the flip side, there can be really good things that come out of the state legislature that impact immigrant communities that the university might not immediately be more broadly aware of. So I looked at that question about the North START Act, and it got me thinking about the North Star Scholarship Program, which is something that got passed in the legislature this past session, which is, and I'll put a link in the chat. It's a scholarship program for students whose families have an income below a certain threshold, making higher ed affordable for them. And that's available to undocumented students as well if they fall under the umbrella of the Minnesota DREAM Act. So talking about multiple programs that have names that sound like other programs. We've got the North START program and the North Star Scholarship. And then there's the federal DREAM Act, which was an immigration law that never got passed. The Minnesota DREAM Act is a tuition equity law, which basically makes resident tuition rates available to immigrant students, even if they're undocumented, if they meet certain criteria. So this program that's going to make college affordable for lower income college students is available to undocumented students as well. But we need to make sure that we get the word out about the availability of things like that. So those are just a couple of examples.
Thanks. So that's great information. Julia, I have a follow-up question here for you that came from the audience about the enforcement of the cannabis laws. And it might be too early to answer this, but are you seeing a discrepancy in practice? Are you seeing law enforcement targeting immigrant communities or treating immigrant communities differently because of the consequences that you mentioned? And then I just also want to throw in another question for you. If you could talk a little bit about what your plans are for the next legislative session and what are you focusing on?
Sure. A lot in there. I will do my best to be concise. So the first thing I think that's a really good question about the enforcement and potential disparate enforcement. Obviously, we're in the very beginning stages of legalization in Minnesota, so it'll be a process to see that and to look at what's happening in terms of enforcement. The other piece of that is that I think you've identified sort of one of the interesting little wrinkles here is that, yes, it's no longer criminalized. And so non-citizens may not receive a criminal conviction if they possess or engage in the sale of or otherwise are engaged in the cannabis industry. The issue is for certain immigration applications, there is a question about, have you ever engaged in, a controlled substance violation or other criminal activity, even if you were never charged or convicted? And these are obviously applications that, people swear to the, truth and accuracy of it, and obviously has great impacts for their potentially permanent residency or even citizenship. And so despite the fact that it's not a criminal offense, it could still wind up coming back to somebody, even if they're never charged or convicted, which is, again, it's just this interaction is so tangled and entwined that it really does take a little bit of, working through these things. And I think it's understandable why maybe a state legislator is not going to be fully versed in that, because of course, why would a state legislator be looking at a particular immigration application and know what the exact wording of that application is? But that's why, having people in the advocacy space who are versed in that immigration expertise to be able to go to them and say, look, this is why we're concerned, or this is where our heartburn is, or this is what you need to know about it. In terms of future plans, so obviously, I think a lot of us are in this space of trying to figure out there were so many good, big things that happened last session. How do we make sure those are being implemented properly while also coming up with new and better ideas for future sessions? One of the things that we've been looking at is, okay, everybody, is now eligible to get these driver's licenses. What about things like auto insurance? and affordability of auto insurance, and how are those rates being set, and how might that be disproportionately affecting certain communities. So looking at ways to make that more equitable, make it more accessible. Continuing to look at the intersection of criminal law and immigration law. Where are there other disparities where a state law conviction may have unfair or disproportionate impacts on non-citizens because of these other immigration consequences. One other area, which this sort of harkens back a little bit to my ACLU days, but looking at surveillance and privacy, the new technologies that are out there, and how certainly there are often detrimental impacts, for instance, with facial recognition technology, and how it is generally pretty poor at recognizing people who are BIPOC, people who are non-binary, and can lead to false, and has led to false arrests, false charges. And these are the kinds of things that will also have the potential to impact immigrant communities. And how can we address that, both from the immigrant community perspective as well as just the general, for all of Minnesota perspective.
Thank you so much. Susan, I have a question for you, because the data that you have and the analysis that you provide is so important to the work of a lot of people here at the university. And I imagine there are a lot of researchers here who want some access to that data. I know that we have many people in the health fields that are doing work within immigrant communities, other people doing community engaged research. What's the best way, and how does your office engage with scholars and other people to share all of the information and analysis that you have?
Well, we'd like to do it more. I tend to be more focused, or more, I guess, I go wherever I'm invited, and I'm invited a lot of times to government types of organizations, whether it's local or state, professional associations. I'd say that in forums like this, or in discussions like this, that's where I tend to interact with folks in higher ed and with scholars. You know, the data that I use, I mentioned, come from, that I often use to study immigration, comes from the Minnesota Populations Center, the IPUMS, where I also kind of got my start a very long time ago in demography. And so that stuff is freely available. It's you know, if you look up the IPUMS, many of you are probably familiar with it, or all of you perhaps. But you know, we're happy to share information that we've analyzed as well from there.
Great, thank you so much for that. Marissa, a couple of questions for you. Isabel is interested in how you disseminate information about scholarships for undocumented students, and if you're also engaging with high school students in the area to get that information out. And then we also had a question for you about how your work has changed since 2017. Obviously, a lot has happened in immigration policy and in the national debate happening over immigration. Can you talk a little bit about how it's affected your work?
Sure. I'll start with the scholarship question. So I think that information is disseminated in a lot of different ways. I think high school counselors are aware, not all of them, but lots of them are aware of this. The Minnesota DREAM Act application sort of runs parallel to the FAFSA process. So if someone is ineligible to fill out a FAFSA because of their immigration status, lots of high school counselors are aware of the Minnesota DREAM Act. The University Admissions Office is also aware of this. I work with them a lot. As soon as I saw the North Star Scholarship come out, I emailed my contacts over there to say, do you all realize, like, is this on your radar? Are you excited about this too? How do we work together to get the word out? I sometimes will also be contacted by admitted students before they start here at the university, by them, or often their parents, to try to help them figure out how this whole process would work. So I think there's room for improvement in the way that information is disseminated, but those are some of the ways that I'm involved in getting the word out. There are also community organizations within different community groups and populations that, for example, like Unidos Minnesota, they do like Minnesota Dream Act application nights where they'll bring students together and help them and their family members fill out those applications. So it's happening at the community level as well. With regard to how the work has changed, it's changed so much, and it's changed not necessarily because the issues have changed entirely. I mean, DACA was top of, how should I say it? For individuals who have DACA or wish they had DACA, things have not changed at all. It's still worrisome. It's still sort of this political football. It's still unresolved. It's more worrisome than it was in many ways back in 2017. But what's changed is the public's attention span or attention level. So in some ways during the Trump administration, things were much harder because there was such a sense of never knowing when things were going to change for the worse and never knowing what change was going to come next and how dramatic it was going to be. But in some ways it was better because these individuals and groups of people had the public's attention. And so there was more energy behind supporting people who were really at risk because of these federal government policies. Things don't, the temperature's not turned up quite as high anymore, but things haven't been resolved for the better in most cases, and there's less public attention and energy. It's this sort of like, if you get used to it being hot outside, then you're used to it being hot outside and you don't notice that you're getting sunburned or that you're sweating all the time or whatever. It's a bad analogy, but you understand what I mean. People have gotten used to living with that higher level of stress, and that's not good. There are also lots of, with the Biden administration, not all, far from all of the issues that came up during the Trump administration have been resolved, but there's also the expansion in really interesting and in many ways positive ways of use of humanitarian immigration options, an expanding group of people who are eligible for some kind of lawful immigration status. And that's exciting, but that also means that there are lots of wraparound supports that are needed, or lots of issues that haven't been considered beforehand that the community is grappling with, state government is grappling with, municipalities, the university. And so there are interesting avenues for expanding the ability of immigrant communities to connect with higher education. The Welcome Corps, which is the sort of private sponsorship of refugee pathways. It's something that's been announced and talked about a lot in the last 6 months to a year. There's an expansion of that called Welcome Corps on campus, which is a way for universities to be involved in refugee resettlement. And that's in the very early stages, but something that I'm connected with and looking into. And so I think that so much of it has changed. The thing that's remained the same is that there's really need for universities to be aware of the fact that immigrant communities are facing extra challenges, and that the universities really do need to play a role in providing resources and being connected with immigrant communities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Susan, I have another question for you, asking you to clarify something that you had said at the beginning of your presentation when you talked about natural population change versus immigration. And can you just talk a little bit more about that and why that's important?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to expand on that. I think I glossed over it pretty quickly. So we know that natural change, which is the number of births in a population minus the number of deaths, is going to contribute less to overall growth in the future. And we know that because the birth rates have been declining over time for decades, and we expect that they will continue to decline into the future. So less growth there due to births. And we also expect to see more deaths because we'll have more people in the high mortality age groups as we age. So this isn't just true of Minnesota, it's true of many other states and for the US overall, that there's this dampened impact of, there's dampened growth because of less natural change due to the aging and the lower birth rates that we are seeing and will see in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Julia, I want to ask you to leave the state of Minnesota for a second and think about the national level. The information we received today really shows that Minnesota is a special place, that our population is unique, that we are a large refugee resettlement state, and generally that means we're quite welcoming. And I was wondering, what do you think that Minnesotans can do to educate people beyond the state, and what role do we have to play in this national conversation?
I think that's in some ways it's a little bit like reading tea leaves. I think certainly Minnesota is unique in a lot of senses. I think one of the things that many of us after this past legislative session have said is, or have sort of been thinking and talking about, is that Minnesota is not necessarily reliably one party has control or the other party has control. We often see a sort of back and forth. And so that means that, and it is sort of a national thing, but it's, obviously focused on Minnesota's impact, is that you often see, a difference in the way we have to approach sort of policy making and decision making because of the less clear sort of what type of political landscape are we going to have in a particular election year. And I'm not necessarily assigning any particular value to that. I think it just means that, Minnesota is not Illinois. It's not North Dakota. It's not even Wisconsin, really. And in the political sense, nobody come for me. And so it means that I think it can be a little bit difficult. I think people should think carefully about how we can either import things from other states that other states have done. It may not work exactly one-to-one, because obviously something that works for California maybe doesn't work for Minnesota, but even closer to home, something that Illinois might have done is not necessarily going to be exactly one-to-one for Minnesota because of potentially different sort of political landscape and just different considerations. And likewise, what we do in Minnesota may be a little bit harder. It may be easy to say, well, let's just scale that up. Let's just put that out to other states, and also understanding that that may not be exactly the right path to just fixing things in other states, right? Because Minnesota is unique in our own way. I do think, just from a involvement perspective, people should keep their eyes out for, different organizations will have, lobby days at the state legislature when the state legislature is in session. And so, if an organization that you support is having a particular event, being aware of that and going to get a chance to talk to your elected representatives and make sure they know what you care about. I mean, I think that's the most direct, important way that everybody can participate. But yeah, I think it's, Minnesota is unique, and that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. Or it can have multiple variables to impact. So
Great, thank you. We're going to wrap it up in a second, but I wanted to ask Marissa one final question. Because our audience is university faculty, students, staff, hopefully this is not the first time they're hearing from you and learning about your office, but do you want to share how people can contact you?
Sure, happily. Thank you. So yes, I'm always looking to connect with people around the university to make sure that they have a place to ask these questions, that I can be a resource or a referral place if that's helpful. So I think the easiest thing to do is probably just to go to the Immigration Response Team website, which is on the resource list that I shared, or it's also happily just immigration.umn.edu. You can also feel free to send me an email at an email address that only an immigration nerd would be excited about, immigration@umn.edu. That's probably the easiest way to connect with me, and please feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to say a very big thank you to all three of our speakers this morning. This was really a wonderful introduction to immigrants in Minnesota and at the U. And thank you for all the wonderful data and information and resources that you shared. Thanks to everybody who joined this webinar, who started your morning with us at 9 a.m. Central. Thank you very much. And I really look forward to communicating with all of you and collaborating in the future. I think we have a wonderful community here in Minnesota, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thanks to my co-sponsors of this event, and thanks to Pat for managing everything behind the scenes. Thank you and have a wonderful day.